You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the heavy summer heat of Los Angeles in 1985. The nights are sticky, restless, and unsettlingly quiet. But beneath that silence, fear is spreading like wildfire. Doors are bolted, windows nailed shut, entire neighborhoods refusing to sleep because somewhere out there, a figure prowls the darkness. They call him the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez was not just another criminal. He was the embodiment of terror. He didn't target one type of victim, nor did he stick to a single method. His unpredictability made him more terrifying than any serial killer before him. Children, elderly couples, young women, no one was safe. He slipped into homes like a shadow, attacking without warning, leaving behind chaos, blood, and satanic symbols as if to mark his reign. But to understand the monster, we must first step back to his beginnings, to the boy who would become one of America's most notorious killers. Born in El Paso, Texas, in 1960, Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was the youngest of 5 children in a family overshadowed by violence. His father, Julian Ramirez, had once been a police officer in Mexico, but in America he struggled with anger and abuse. His rages often turned the Ramirez household into a war zone. Richard, quiet and withdrawn, often escaped into the night, sleeping in cemeteries or wandering the streets to avoid the fury within his home. As a child, he was plagued by epileptic seizures. But there was something darker to an early fascination with death. By the age of 12, Richard's greatest influence became his older cousin, Miguel. Miguel had returned from the Vietnam War with a scrapbook of horror photographs of mutilated women, prisoners, and victims he claimed to have tortured and killed. Richard, impressionable and already detached, absorbed these images like they were lessons. Miguel even showed him how to stalk and dominate. And one night, in front of Richard's young eyes, Miguel shot his wife in the face during a domestic argument. This was the turning point. Where most would recoil, Richard grew more obsessed. Violence became normalized. Death became intimate. And Satan introduced to him, through books, rituals, and symbols, became his silent companion. By his teenage years, Richard was addicted to drugs, stealing, and breaking into homes. Burglary became a game, and with each successful theft, he sharpened the skills he would later use to stalk, to terrify, and to kill. But El Paso was just the beginning. By the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez had moved to California. The city of angels would become his hunting ground. When Richard Ramirez arrived in California, the bustling streets of Los Angeles seemed endless, a city filled with opportunity, but not for the kind of future most people dreamed of. For Richard, LA was not a city of hope. It was a hunting ground. By day, he was almost invisible tall, gaunt, with sunken eyes and rotting teeth. He drifted through cheap hotels, pawn shops, and neighborhoods where no one asked him any questions. But by night, the streets transformed. The cover of darkness was his ally, the silence of sleeping households his invitation. In 1984, the city barely knew his name. That would soon change. On June 28th, 79-year-old Jenny Vinco was found brutally murdered in her apartment. Her throat had been slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Police were horrified by the brutality, but they had no suspect, no leads, no motive. To them, it looked like a random act of violence and isolated tragedy in a city already struggling with crime. But Richard Ramirez was just beginning. Over the next year, Los Angeles would become paralyzed by a series of murders, assaults, and home invasions that seemed to have no pattern except the fear they left behind. Unlike other killers, Ramirez did not choose victims based on age, race, or social standing. He targeted men and women, young and old, the wealthy and the poor. That randomness made him a phantom the city could not guard against. He slipped into homes through unlocked windows, back doors, even garages. Once inside, his methods were brutal and chaotic. Sometimes he shot his victims with a stolen .22 caliber handgun. Sometimes he stabbed them repeatedly. Other times, he used a tire iron, a machete, or simply his bare hands. The horror was not just in the killings, it was in what he left behind. Survivors spoke of a tall man with wild, staring eyes who whispered about Satan, demanding they swear to the devil in several homes. He left pentagrams scrawled on walls, mirrors, even on his victims' bodies. For the first time, Los Angeles faced not only a murderer, but a self-proclaimed servant of darkness. The press quickly gave him a name, the Night Stalker. And with every headline, every evening news broadcast, the fear spread. Families who once left their doors open began barricading themselves in. Hardware stores ran out of locks, security bars, and guns. Neighbors formed patrols, staying awake through the night to guard their streets. But Ramirez was relentless. In March 1985, he struck again, attacking Maria Hernandez and her roommate in Rosemead. Maria survived, but her roommate, Dale Okazaki, was not so lucky. That same evening, he murdered Sileon Veronica Yu in Monterey Park. The police knew, without question, that Los Angeles was under siege. The randomness was his power. Police struggled to connect the crimes because each attack looked different. Ramirez shifted weapons, varied his entry points, and left behind a trail of victims that seemed to mock law enforcement. The city lived in panic. People stopped walking alone at night. Some refused to sleep at all. Parents taught their children not to open the door for anyone. And every creak in the floorboards, every rustle outside a window, became a reason to dial 911. But for Richard Ramirez, this terror was fuel. He thrived on it. He wanted the city to shiver at his name. He wanted his killings to be rituals offerings to the darkness he worshipped. And in his twisted mind, he was succeeding. By the spring of 1985, the Night Stalker was more than a headline, he was a living nightmare. Every morning, Angelenos woke up to the latest breaking news. Another break-in, another murder, another family destroyed. Detectives knew they were dealing with a different kind of predator. Unlike serial killers who stuck to a type, Ramirez's victims ranged from children as young as 6 to elderly grandparents in their 70s. He didn't care who they were or where they lived. If your window was open, if your door was unlocked, you could be next. For the LAPD and Sheriff's Department, this randomness was maddening. Investigators from different precincts began comparing notes. A pattern, however, twisted was starting to form. The killer often left shoe prints from a size 11 and a half-obvious sneaker. It was a rare brand, not widely sold in the U.S. Police clung to this as their first real lead. But Ramirez wasn't slowing down. On March 27th, he struck in Whittier, brutally attacking Vincent and Maxine Zatsara. Vincent was shot while sleeping. Maxine was assaulted and mutilated in a way that horrified even veteran detectives. Ramirez carved a pentagram on her body and left more satanic symbols in the home. News outlets were relentless. Reporters labeled him the devil's disciple, and whispers of a satanic killer spread across Los Angeles. Churches filled with people praying for protection. Gun sales skyrocketed. The city was on the edge of hysteria. But then came the survivors. In Monterey Park, a 16-year-old girl described a tall, gaunt man with bad teeth and crazy eyes. Another victim recalled the same detail, those eyes sunken, black, filled with something inhuman. Survivors reported his obsession with Satan, recalling how he forced them to swear to the devil to save their lives. The composite sketch began circulating. A face emerged, sharp cheekbones, messy hair, eyes that seemed to pierce the paper. When the sketch hit the airwaves, fear exploded. It was no longer just a phantom lurking in the dark. Now he had a face. Yet the killings didn't stop. In April, in Monrovia, Ramirez attacked William and Lillian Doy. William, despite being critically wounded, managed to call 911 before dying. His courage gave investigators valuable minutes to respond, though the killer still slipped away. Then in May, in Monterey Park again, Ramirez assaulted Ruth Wilson and her son, forcing them to swear allegiance to Satan before vanishing into the night. The satanic overtones grew bolder. He wasn't just killing for pleasure. He was sending a message. For police, it became a desperate race. They worked around the clock, piecing together fragments, the shoe prints, the stolen cars he abandoned, the whispered words survivors remembered. But Ramirez was always one step ahead, striking in new neighborhoods before the police could catch up. The press turned him into something larger than lifer, monster haunting California's nights. Parents tucked their children in with fear instead of comfort. Couples double-locked their doors. Even hardened detectives admitted they slept with guns at their bedside. And still, Ramirez smiled in the shadows, savoring the chaos. The city was playing his game. He was no longer just Richard Ramirez, a drifter from Texas. He was the Night Stalker, and he wanted everyone to know it. Summer of 1985. The heat in Los Angeles was suffocating, but the fear was even heavier. By now, the Night Stalker wasn't just a headline, he was a specter creeping into every home, every nightmare. Families slept with the lights on. Hardware stores couldn't keep deadbolts, security bars, or window locks in stock. Dog adoptions spiked as people sought protection. And the police swamped with calls, tips, and false leads were under crushing pressure. The public wanted answers. They wanted the devil behind bars, but Richard Ramirez kept moving. On May 29th, he struck in Monrovia. A woman survived his assault and gave police more chilling details. He was tall, thin, smelled of decay, and muttered about Satan throughout the attack. The press devoured every word. The nickname Night Stalker became permanent. By June, his attacks stretched further. Arcadia, Pico Rivera, Diamond Bar each new murder sent shockwaves across Southern California. And each crime scene was more brutal, more unhinged. He left inverted pentagrams on walls. Victims were forced to beg for mercy in the name of Satan. This wasn't just violence, it was ritual. Detectives now had a clearer trail. The Avia sneaker print kept showing up. Police traced the model to a small number of stores in the U.S. Only one pair, in that size, had been sold in Los Angeles. If they found the man with those shoes, they'd find the killer, but Ramirez wasn't worried. He thought he was untouchable. He moved like a phantom, stealing cars, discarding them, and laughing at the chaos he left behind. Then came July 5th. In Sierra Madre, Ramirez bludgeoned a 16-year-old girl named Whitney Bennett, leaving her for dead, but she survived. Her description matched the composite sketch perfectly. The nightmare was no longer faceless. As the city demanded action, law enforcement agencies combined forces. The LAPD, Sheriff's Department, and even the FBI joined the hunt. They pored over stolen car reports, burglary records, and fingerprints. Finally, a breakthrough came in August. Ramirez had stolen a car and abandoned it in Los Angeles. Inside, investigators found a single fingerprint on the rearview mirror. At the time, police fingerprint databases were primitive compared to today, but this time the system worked. The print matched Richard Ramirez, a drifter with a long rap sheet of theft, drugs, and violence. For the first time, the Night Stalker had a name. On August 29, 1985, police held a press conference. They released his photo, a gaunt, sharp-faced man with messy hair, hollow cheeks, and those unmistakable eyes. The media blasted his face across every newspaper, every TV channel. Los Angeles finally knew the monster haunting them. But Richard Ramirez wasn't hiding. The very next day, unaware that his face was everywhere, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles. Customers recognized him immediately. That's him. The Night Stalker, someone shouted. Panic erupted. Ramirez bolted, running through streets, jumping fences, desperate to escape. But this time, the people fought back. Residents chased him down, cornered him, and beat him bloody with pipes and sticks until police arrived. The reign of terror was over. From the shadows of the city to the bright glare of justice, Richard Ramirez was no longer a phantom. He was flesh and blood. He was captured. But the story was far from over. The capture of Richard Ramirez was unlike anything Los Angeles had ever seen. The monster, who had crept silently into homes, who had left the city paralyzed with fear, was finally dragged out into the open not by elite police forces, but by the very community he had terrorized. On August 31, 1985, the Night Stalker sat handcuffed, bruised, and bloodied in the back of a police car. The crowd that had caught him jeered and shouted, some chanting, "Kill him, kill the devil." Others simply looked on in disbelief. For months, they had lived in dread. And now, the nightmare had a human face. But that was perhaps the most chilling part. Richard Ramirez did not look like the horned demon people had imagined. He was thin, with sunken cheeks, stringy black hair, and eyes that flickered with an unsettling mix of arrogance and emptiness. And as the news cameras zoomed in, he smirked, almost proud of the chaos he had caused. The trial that followed would become one of the most infamous in American history. By 1989, Ramirez was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The evidence was overwhelming: fingerprints, ballistic matches, eyewitness testimony, and the infamous Avia shoe print. Prosecutors painted him as a sadistic predator who worshipped Satan and thrived on fear. But Ramirez seemed to enjoy the spotlight. In court, he arrived wearing black sunglasses, flashing pentagrams drawn on his hands. He sneered at victims' families, licked his lips for the cameras, and carved his own legend as the devil's servant. At one point, he raised his hand, revealing a pentagram on his palm, and shouted, "Hail Satan!" The courtroom gasped. To Ramirez, it was a performance. He wasn't just on trial, he was on stage. The media devoured it. Newspapers splashed his face across front pages. Television news dissected his every move. To some, he was the devil incarnate. To others, he was a bizarre, magnetic figure, dark, dangerous, and strangely charismatic. That charisma drew an unsettling following. Women began writing him letters, sending him photographs, even proposing marriage. Some came to court dressed in black, wearing pentagram necklaces, hoping to catch his eye. The phenomenon of killer groupies shocked the public, raising questions about fascination with evil. But for the families of his victims, the trial was agony. Survivors testified in harrowing detail, recounting how Ramirez had slipped into their homes, whispered about Satan, and destroyed their lives in minutes. Parents wept as they described children who would never recover. Elderly relatives mourned loved ones taken in senseless brutality. After months of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all counts. The judge sentenced him to death, declaring, "You will spend the rest of your natural life in the confines of San Quentin prison until you are executed in the manner prescribed by law. This society cannot tolerate another night of terror." And yet, Ramirez smirked. As he was led out, he delivered one final chilling message to reporters. Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. "I'll see you in Disneyland." The word cemented his legacy not as a remorseful man facing justice, but as a defiant killer who reveled in his infamy. For the victims' families, the trial's end was both a relief and a hollow victory. Ramirez was off the streets, but the scars he left behind would never heal. But this wasn't the end of Richard Ramirez's story. Behind prison walls, his myth only grew. When the steel gates of San Quentin prison slammed, shut behind Richard Ramirez, many Californians finally breathed a sigh of relief. The Night Stalker was no longer free to prowl the streets, no longer able to slip into homes under the cover of darkness. He was contained, caged like the predator he was. But the story did not end with his conviction. In some ways, it only grew stranger. Inside San Quentin, Ramirez became an infamous figure among inmates. Death row is reserved for the most violent criminals, yet even there he stood out. His gaunt frame, sunken eyes, and devilish smirk gave him a presence that unsettled even hardened killers. He thrived on his reputation. He corresponded with fans, relished the letters pouring in from around the world, and even entertained the notion of himself as a dark celebrity. Women continued to write him, some claiming they were in love with him despite never meeting him. One of those women, a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Lyoy, became his most devoted admirer. Doreen wrote him over 75 letters during his incarceration. To the shock of many, She eventually married him in 1996, holding a bizarre wedding ceremony inside San Quentin. She proclaimed her undying love, declaring that Ramirez was her soulmate and that she believed he was innocent of the crimes he had been convicted of. The media pounced. Headlines called Ramirez the devil who found a bride. Talk shows debated the psychology of women obsessed with killers. To the families of his victims, it was another slap in the face proof that Ramirez had succeeded in twisting his evil into something that drew fascination instead of only fear. But prison life was far from glamorous. Ramirez spent his years confined to a small cell on death row, isolated for 23 hours a day. He was allowed brief exercise time in a yard surrounded by guards and fences. Still, he seemed unfazed. In interviews, he spoke coldly about life and death, dismissing remorse as weakness. "I gave up on love and happiness a long time ago," he once said. "Why bother?" Despite his bravado, time was catching up with him. The state of California carried out executions slowly, and his appeals dragged on for years. As the decades passed, Ramirez's health began to deteriorate. He suffered from hepatitis C, drug damage from his younger years, and a weakening body that no longer matched the menacing figure he once projected. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at the age of 53. Not by lethal injection, as the court had sentenced, but from complications of B-cell lymphoma while awaiting execution. He had spent nearly 24 years on death row. His death was almost anticlimactic. The man who had held Los Angeles in a grip of terror, who had scrawled pentagrams on walls, and declared allegiance to Satan, slipped away quietly in a hospital bed, guarded and alone. For the families of his victims, there was some closure, but no true justice. Ramirez never expressed remorse, never apologized, never acknowledged the horror he unleashed. He left behind a legacy of pain, fear, and unanswered questions. Yet, even after death, his shadow lingers. Documentaries, books, and even fan sites keep his story alive. To some, he remains a chilling cautionary tale about unchecked violence, trauma, and obsession with evil. To others, disturbingly, he became a cult figure proof of society's unsettling fascination with monsters. Richard Ramirez wanted to be remembered, and in that he succeeded. Not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a reminder of the darkest side of humanity. The story of Richard Ramirez is not just about one man's violence, it is about the terror he cast over millions of lives. Think of Los Angeles in 1985, a city that usually pulsed with dreams. Sunshine and nightlife became a city of locked doors and sleepless nights. Families huddled together in fear. Strangers eyed each other with suspicion. People whispered his name in grocery stores, gas stations, and schoolyards. That was the true power of the Night Stalker. He didn't just kill. He controlled the atmosphere of an entire city. But beneath the horror lies an unsettling truth. Richard Ramirez wasn't a supernatural figure. He wasn't a demon who appeared out of thin air. He was a human being born into a violent home, shaped by trauma, obsession, and addiction. The monster wasn't created in a single night. He was made over years, layer by layer. And yet, despite his human origins, he embraced the persona of evil. He leaned into it. Ramirez wanted to be feared. wanted to be remembered as the devil's disciple. He relished the cameras, the headlines, the whispers, the irony. In the end, his reign of terror was ended not by black magic, nor by Satan, nor even by elite investigators, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him slip away. The people of East Los Angeles rose up, chased him down, and beat him until the police arrived. The community he tried to terrorize became the force that destroyed him. That final twist should remind us of something important. Fear is powerful, but unity is stronger. Richard Ramirez spent nearly a quarter of a century locked in a cell, worshipped by a few, despised by most, and ultimately undone by his own frailty. His story is a warning, a reminder of how darkness festers, how trauma breeds monsters, and how society sometimes feeds them with attention and obsession. But it is also a reminder of resilience. Despite the scars he left behind, Los Angeles survived, families endured, and the man who called himself the servant of Satan died alone, powerless, his terror silenced. So tonight, as you lock your doors, as you glance at the shadows just beyond the light, remember this: monsters like Richard Ramirez walk among us not in fairy tales, but in reality. They may look ordinary, they may even smile, charm, and blend in. But the darkness they carry can change everything. The Night Stalker wanted to live forever in fear. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a story told not to glorify him but to ensure we never forget the devastation he caused. And as the city of Los Angeles sleeps today, safer, quieter, and unafraid, one truth lingers: evil can stalk the night, but it can also be stopped.